My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old, and 3 weeks ago I found out that the name I've signed on every school paper, job application, and mortgage document for the past 3 decades isn't mine. My parents had changed my last name when I was a child, without my consent, without even telling me, and they did it to erase every trace of my real father from my life. And last month, I learned the ugliest truth of all. They did it so they could steal the $500,000 estate he left behind. If you've ever had your own family strip away your identity for their own gain, comment where you're watching from. Like this video, subscribe, and join a community where we speak the truths our families tried to bury. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, in a 2-story beige house with peeling paint and a lilac bush that bloomed stubbornly every spring. My childhood looked normal from the outside: public school, Sunday dinners, family road trips to the Oregon coast. But there were shadows in the corners of our home, quiet rules I didn't understand but learned not to question. I was 4 years old when my mother married David Miller, the man I've called Dad my whole life. My earliest memory of him is in our tiny kitchen, flipping pancakes on a Saturday morning. He smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee, and his voice was the kind that could be both warm and terrifying depending on the day. As far back as I can remember, my last name was Miller. I thought that was just how it had always been. My mother rarely spoke about my biological father. When she did, it was vague and dismissive. "She wasn't a good man," she'd say, or, "That's a part of the past you don't need to worry about." Whenever I asked more, she'd shut down completely, her face hardening in a way that told me not to push. As a child, you don't question these things. You believe the story you're given. I grew up believing that David had taken me in as his own because my real dad didn't care enough to stick around. I didn't know that wasn't the truth. The first time I felt the oddness of my identity was in 2nd grade. We had a family tree assignment, and while other kids filled their branches with grandparents and cousins, I only had half of mine. "What about your dad's side?" my teacher asked. I remember looking down at the paper, my pencil frozen, and saying, "We don't talk about them." She gave me that polite smile adults use when they don't want to push a subject, and that was the end of it. Life moved on. I went to high school, then community college, then transferred to a state university for a degree in marketing. By my mid-20s, I was working at a regional ad agency, engaged to a man named Lucas, and living a fairly unremarkable life. I still signed everything as Claire Miller. My driver's license, my lease, my bank accounts, all matched that name without question. It wasn't until last month, when a manila envelope showed up in my mailbox, that the cracks in the story started to show. It was a legal notice from an attorney's office in Portland. Inside was a letter that began, "We have been attempting to reach the legal heir of the late Jonathan Price." I froze. The name Jonathan Price rang a faint, distant bell in my mind, something I had heard once as a child and tucked away. I read on. "Mr. Price passed away on March 14th of this year. According to our records, you are his biological daughter and sole heir to his estate, currently valued at approximately $500,000. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The letter went on to explain that multiple attempts had been made to contact me, but my listed name and address hadn't matched public records for Claire Price, and only recently had they connected the dots. I must have read the letter a dozen times, the words blurring in front of my eyes. Biological daughter, sole heir, estate. I sat there in my kitchen, the same one I'd once seen David flipping pancakes in, and felt my stomach twist into something sharp and nauseating. The next paragraph shattered everything. "Our office contacted your listed next of kin, David and Margaret Miller, in April. They informed us that you had no interest in claiming the estate, and requested that all matters be redirected to them as your legal guardians on file at the time of the name change. I dropped the letter onto the table like it had burned me. My parents knew. They'd known for months. And instead of telling me, they'd posed as my legal representatives, claimed I didn't care, and, if the implication was correct, redirected my father's $500,000 estate into their own hands. My first thought was disbelief, then anger, then the deep, raw ache of betrayal. All those years of avoiding questions about my biological father, of insisting my name had always been Miller. It was a cover-up. I tried to piece together what I knew about Jonathan Price, which wasn't much. I remembered hearing my mother's voice once, muffled through a closed bedroom door, saying, "Jonathan doesn't matter anymore." I remembered being about 6 years old and finding a photo in the attic of a man with warm brown eyes and a crooked smile, holding a baby that I now realize was me. When I brought it to my mother, she snatched it from my hands and told me never to go through her things again. Now, every memory felt like a breadcrumb I hadn't realized was leading somewhere. The letter included a contact number for the attorney. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped my phone dialing it. A woman named Marla answered. I told her I was Claire Miller, that I'd received a letter about Jonathan Price's estate. There was a long pause before she said, "Oh, we were told you didn't want to be involved." Her voice softened as I explained I had no idea any of this existed until now. She confirmed that my birth certificate originally read Claire Marie Price, but that it had been legally changed to Miller when I was 5 years old. She said the court documents were signed by both my mother and David Miller, citing family unity as the reason. Marla also confirmed that the estate, a mix of real estate, savings, and life insurance, had been fully transferred 3 months ago to the legal guardians of the minor child, because according to their records, I was still legally under their representation at the time of claim filing. I was 32 years old. That's when the ice in my stomach turned to fire. They hadn't just hidden my identity, they'd stolen my inheritance, using a decades-old legal technicality to make it look legitimate. I sat there for hours, the unopened manila envelope beside me, trying to reconcile the parents who raised me with the people capable of doing this. Every birthday, every Christmas, every casual, "We love you." Was it all just a lie built on the foundation of what they'd taken from me? The truth was, I didn't know yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the kind of betrayal you could just forgive. This was war. When I was a kid, I thought all families had invisible rules. I didn't know they were invisible until I grew up and realized other people's homes weren't filled with the same unspoken silences, the same sudden changes of subject, the same locked drawers and closed doors you didn't dare touch. My earliest memories are hazy snapshots, the smell of cinnamon toast in the morning, the sound of my mother's heels on the kitchen tile, David's deep laugh when the Seahawks were winning. But mixed in are the odd gaps. I never saw baby pictures before I was 2. I never met anyone from my dad's side. I never heard his name spoken aloud. It wasn't until years later that I'd understand those gaps weren't just accidents. They were erasures. I was 5 the summer my mother and David took me on what they called a very important day. I remember wearing a scratchy pink dress and shiny shoes. We drove to a tall, echoing building with a big American flag in front, the courthouse, though I didn't know the word then. My mother told me we were taking a family picture and meeting a nice man who would help make us official. Inside, I sat in a hallway clutching a coloring book while my parents talked to a woman behind a high desk. They signed papers, the kind adults always seem to be trading like secrets. At one point, David crouched down and asked me if I liked having the same last name as him. I nodded because what 5-year-old is going to say no to that? What I didn't know was that the papers they signed that day erased Price from my identity. The man in the photo I once found in the attic, the one with my same crooked smile, was being deleted in ink. Growing up, I didn't think much about names. At school, I was Claire Miller. At home, I was Claire Bear when my mom was in a good mood, or Young Lady when she wasn't. My friends' parents knew me as David's daughter. It was simple, until it wasn't. In third grade, during a unit on family heritage, we were asked to bring in something that represented our background. My best friend, Melissa, brought a quilt her grandmother had made in Ireland. Another boy brought a photo album of his grandparents in Italy. I brought nothing. When I asked my mom what to take, she frowned like I'd asked the wrong question. "We're American," she said flatly. "You don't need to bring anything." "But what about before?" I'd pressed. "Like, our family from a long time ago?" Her lips tightened. "This is our family. You, me, and David. That's all that matters." It was one of the first times I felt the wall, the hard, unmovable wall that went up whenever the subject of my past came close to surfacing. There were other moments, too, little inconsistencies that didn't make sense, like the time in middle school when I needed my birth certificate to sign up for a soccer league that traveled out of state. My mom handed it over quickly, but I caught a glimpse of a faint crease in the paper, like something had been folded over. Later, I would learn that the crease covered the amended notation, proof it had been altered after the original was issued. Or the time I overheard my parents arguing late at night. David's voice was sharp, my mother's tense. "You can't just pretend it never happened," he hissed. "She'll find out eventually." "She won't," my mother shot back. "Not if we're careful. And if she does, it won't matter by then." At the time, I thought maybe they were talking about some old family drama, a distant fight with a relative I didn't know. Now I know they were talking about him, about Jonathan Price. By high school, I'd stopped asking questions. Curiosity had a price in our house, a tightening of my mother's mouth, a withdrawal of warmth, a sudden list of chores that kept me too busy to think. So I learned to let sleeping dogs lie, as David liked to say. But there were still cracks in the story. When I turned 16, I applied for my first part-time job at the local grocery store. Filling out the paperwork, I hesitated at the box for birth name. I wrote Miller, just like always. The manager barely looked at it, but a week later, my social security card came in the mail, and something about the font looked off. My mother whisked it away before I could examine it closely, saying she'd file it somewhere safe. I didn't see it again until I was 27, and by then I was too distracted with work and bills to question it. I think that's what my parents counted on, that life would keep me busy enough not to notice the missing pieces. And for a long time, it worked. But looking back, the signs were everywhere. There was the old shoebox in my mother's closet that I wasn't supposed to touch. Once, when I was about 9, I opened it while she was in the shower. Inside were letters addressed to me. My name in looping handwriting I didn't recognize, postmarked from Portland. Some were never opened. I remember one had a smudge where the ink had run, as if from rain or tears. I had just started to pull one out when my mother's voice called from the hallway. I shoved the lid back on and pushed the box under her sweaters. That was the last time I saw it. Even David, who wasn't given to emotional moments, slipped once. I was 17, helping him sand down an old dresser in the garage. He handed me a piece of sandpaper and said, almost absent-mindedly, "Your dad would have liked this kind of work." I looked up, confused. "You mean, you?" He froze for a second, then cleared his throat. "Yeah, sure." He didn't look me in the eye after that. At the time, I didn't know what to make of it. Now I can see it for what it was. A ghost of the truth slipping through before he could shove it back into the dark. For 32 years, I lived in the reality they built for me. I told myself that if my biological father had wanted to be in my life, he would have been. That David was the only father I needed. That my mother's silences were acts of protection, not deception. But the letter from Marla's office burned those illusions to the ground. And once I let myself remember those small, strange moments, the shoebox, the folded birth certificate, the half-finished sentences, I couldn't stop seeing them everywhere. The hardest part wasn't realizing they'd lied. It was realizing how many times they'd had to actively choose the lie over the truth. How many birthdays and holidays they'd smiled at me knowing exactly what they'd taken. How many times they'd looked me in the eye and called me Miller when they knew that wasn't my name. They didn't just rewrite my childhood. They rewrote me. And now, every memory I have feels suspect, as if I can't trust my own past without cross-checking it against the truth they tried to bury. That's when I knew. If I wanted the real story, I couldn't just wait for them to tell me. I was going to have to dig it up myself, piece by piece, no matter what I found. And I was going to start with the one place they could never completely erase: the official records. The day after I got the letter, I took off work without telling anyone why. My excuse to my boss was personal matters, but the truth was, I needed the kind of day where you don't answer phone calls, don't answer the door, a day where you quietly turn over the rocks in your life and brace for whatever you might find crawling underneath. I started with the attic. It wasn't an easy decision. The attic had always been my mother's domain, a place for storage, which meant boxes she didn't want anyone else touching. But I still had a spare key to their house, and I knew they'd both be gone for most of the day. If they'd hidden things from me once, I had to assume some of those things were still physically here. The attic smelled like dust and insulation, and the single overhead bulb cast shadows that made everything feel more clandestine. I moved carefully, opening boxes that looked old enough to have been from my childhood. At first, it was just the usual: Christmas decorations, old board games, a box of my high school art projects. But then, tucked in the far corner behind a stack of suitcases, I found a plastic tub with a cracked lid. The masking tape label said, "Miscellaneous Claire," in my mother's neat handwriting. Inside were baby clothes I didn't recognize, a faded stuffed bear, and at the bottom, a thin manila folder. My hand shook as I opened it. The first page made my breath catch. An original birth certificate. Not the amended one I'd seen before, but the real thing. Claire Marie Price. Father, Jonathan Price. Mother, Margaret Lane. Issued at Providence Street, Vincent Hospital, Portland, Oregon. It was like looking at a ghost version of myself, the one I might have been if they'd left my name alone. Beneath it was the amended certificate, the one dated 2 years later. The difference was stark. My surname was now Miller, father listed as David Miller, same birth date and hospital, but with a tiny footnote at the bottom: amended, Order of Superior Court, Spokane County. The file also held photocopies of court documents from the day I remembered at the courthouse, the family picture day, in the scratchy pink dress. One page stood out, a petition stating that the name change was to foster family unity and avoid confusion for the minor child. Signed by both my mother and David. There was nothing about my father's consent, nothing about informing him. I sat there in the dust, my knees pulled up, staring at the documents. Part of me wanted to slam the box shut and never look again. But another part, the part that had been building since the letter arrived, wanted to tear through every piece of paper until I had the whole truth. The next item was a small bundle of envelopes tied together with twine. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Looping, careful letters I'd seen once before in that shoebox years ago. Every envelope was addressed to me, but none had been opened. Postmarks ranged from 1998 to 2003. all from Portland, all from Jonathan Price. My throat felt tight as I held them. This wasn't some absent father who didn't care. This was a man who had been trying to reach me, and someone had been intercepting him. I slipped the letters into my tote bag, along with the original birth certificate and the court paperwork. I didn't know yet how they'd fit into the legal puzzle, but I knew they were proof. Proof that my history wasn't what they'd told me. Proof that my name had been stolen before my inheritance ever was. On my way out of the house, I hesitated at the hall closet. Inside, stacked neatly on the top shelf, were my parents' old tax returns. I pulled down the years around 2003, the year the last letter was postmarked. And there it was, a Schedule C for consulting income, with a single payment of $15,000 from Price Holdings LLC. It was the first tangible connection between them and my father's money. I left the attic with my tote heavy, both physically and emotionally. The documents felt like contraband, dangerous but necessary. When I got home, I called Marla, the attorney from Portland. I told her what I'd found, and her tone changed immediately from professional detachment to sharp interest. "Claire, these documents could be critical," she said. "The original birth certificate confirms your legal identity before the change, and if those letters can be authenticated, they demonstrate an ongoing relationship your father tried to maintain. That could undermine any claim that he abandoned you or relinquished rights." "What about the tax record?" I asked. "That's very interesting," she said slowly. "If your mother or David received payments from him, we need to know under what circumstances, especially if it lines up with when the contact stopped." Her next words lit a fire in me. "Claire, if we can prove they profited from severing your connection with your father, this case becomes more than an inheritance dispute. It becomes fraud." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of me, tracing the ink with my fingertips. I didn't open them yet. Some part of me wanted to read them in the right setting, somewhere I could hear his voice in the words without the sound of my own rage drowning it out. Instead, I made a list. Every document I had, every question I needed answered, every name I remembered from the fragments of stories they'd told me. The next morning, I went to the county clerk's office to request the full file from the 1995 name change case. The clerk, a man in his 60s with thick glasses, typed my name and scanned his screen. "You said Claire Miller?" he asked. "Yes." He frowned. "Funny. This file's indexed under Claire Price, too. Same case number." When he brought the file to the counter, my stomach dropped. Inside was an affidavit from my mother stating that my father's whereabouts were unknown and that no contact had been made for several years. I knew now that was a lie. The unopened letters proved it. There was also a notarized statement from David claiming he wished to assume all legal responsibilities for me and that Jonathan Price had no objection. But there was no signature from Jonathan anywhere. No evidence he'd even been notified. As I stood there flipping through the file, I realized something chilling. If they'd been willing to lie to the court about his absence, they'd have no problem lying to an estate attorney decades later. By the time I left the clerk's office, I knew this was bigger than a family dispute. It was a pattern, a deliberate campaign to erase my father from my life. And now, to erase my right to what he left me. That night, I finally opened the first letter. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting careful but warm. "Dear Claire, I hope you're doing well in school this year. I think about you every day. I'm working on fixing up the boat, and maybe someday we can sail together. Your mom hasn't let me visit, but I want you to know that I love you no matter what you're told." I didn't realize I was crying until the ink blurred under my tears. I read every letter in one sitting. He wrote about birthdays he missed, books he thought I'd like, little bits of advice. They weren't grand declarations, They were the everyday words of a father who was trying, in the only way he was allowed, to stay in my life. By the end, my grief had hardened into something else: resolve. If they thought changing my name was enough to bury the truth, they were wrong. I was going to dig it all up, even if I had to burn the ground they'd planted their lies in. The decision to confront them wasn't sudden. It had been building, hour by hour, since I found the letters. Every time I reread one, every time I saw my real name in my father's handwriting, the urge grew stronger. I couldn't stand another day of pretending we were just a normal family when I had evidence in my hands that proved otherwise. I didn't tell them I was coming. I didn't want them to have time to prepare their defenses, to hide or destroy anything else. I wanted to see their faces when they realized the truth had clawed its way to the surface. It was a Saturday morning, gray skies over Spokane, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones. My parents' beige two-story looked the same as it always had: trimmed lawn, wind chimes on the porch, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the open kitchen window. David answered the door. He was still in his flannel pajama pants, a coffee mug in one hand. His expression shifted from casual surprise to guarded suspicion the second he saw me. "Claire, we weren't expecting you." "I know," I said, stepping past him before he could block me. "We need to talk." My mother was at the kitchen table reading the paper. She looked up, startled, then smiled in that automatic, practiced way she did when company showed up. "Well, this is a surprise. What's going on, sweetheart?" I didn't bother with small talk. I set my tote bag on the table, pulled out the original birth certificate, the court documents, and the stack of unopened letters, and laid them down in front of her. Her smile faltered. David set his coffee down slowly. "Where did you get these?" my mother asked, her voice already carrying that edge I knew so well, the one that meant she was calculating her next move. "From the attic," I said evenly. "From a box labeled Miscellaneous, Claire. These," I pointed to the birth certificate and court order, "show my real name was Claire Price. They show you changed it to Miller when I was 5 without telling me. And these," I tapped the letters, "are from my father. Letters you never gave me. Not one." Her eyes flicked to David. He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "We did what we thought was best for you." Best for me. I felt my voice sharpen, but I didn't pull it back. Erasing my father's name from my life, lying to a court that you didn't know where he was, keeping his letters from me, and now taking his estate when he died? That made them both flinch. My mother recovered first, folding her hands neatly on the table like she was about to conduct a PTA meeting. "Claire, your father, Jonathan, was not the man you think he was. He was unstable. He drank too much. He couldn't hold a job. I was protecting you from disappointment and instability." "Then why not tell me the truth?" I shot back. "Why not let me read his letters and decide for myself? Why pretend he disappeared when he was writing to me for years?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. David stepped in, his voice deep and defensive. "Because kids don't understand those things. You were too young to know what was good for you. We gave you a stable home, a roof over your head, opportunities." "Opportunities you partly paid for with money from him," I interrupted, pulling out the tax return I'd found. "I saw it, David. $15,000 from Price Holdings in 2003. Was that part of the deal? You cut him out of my life, he sends you hush money?" David's face darkened. "Watch yourself." "No," I said, my voice steady despite the heat in my chest. "You watch yourself, because I have an attorney now, and she's already looking at how you claimed his estate without telling me. You told them I wasn't interested. That's fraud." My mother's composure cracked. "Claire, this is not the way to handle family matters. This stopped being a family matter when you stole $500,000 from me." The words landed heavy in the kitchen. My mother's eyes flickered, the tiniest flash of guilt before she masked it. David didn't even pretend. He looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "That money wouldn't have been safe in your hands. You'd have blown through it or let someone take advantage of you." I almost laughed. The absurdity was so sharp it was bitter. Safe in my hands? You mean safe in yours, so you could spend it without ever telling me it existed? My mother finally stood, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. "We can discuss this later. Emotions are high right now." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "We discuss it now, because I'm done with your version of the truth. I have the documents, I have the letters, and I'm going to get the rest. Court records, bank statements, whatever it takes. You can either come clean now, or you can do it under oath." That hit her. She sank back into her chair. David muttered something under his breath I didn't catch. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. When my mother spoke again, her voice was low. "Jonathan didn't fight for you. Not in court, not in person. He wrote those letters because it was easy, but he wasn't there." I pulled one of the letters from the stack and slid it toward her. "Read it." She didn't touch it. "He was trying," I said. "You made sure I never knew, and maybe you think that's justified because you convinced yourself you were protecting me. But what you did was take away my choice, and now you've taken away what he left me." David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You really want to take this to court? You think you'll win?" I didn't blink. "Yes." He sat back, but the challenge in his stare didn't fade. "I'm giving you a chance," I continued. "Return what you took. Tell the truth. We can deal with the estate through lawyers without dragging everything into the open. But if you stonewall me, every lie you've told is going to be on the record." My mother looked away first. "We need time to think." "You've had decades to think," I said, gathering the documents back into my tote. "You've got a week." I walked out without waiting for a response. The cool air outside hit me like a slap, but it felt cleaner than the stifling tension of the kitchen. My hands were still shaking as I got into my car, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of finally saying the things I'd been swallowing for years. They would either cave or they'd fight. Either way, I was ready. I didn't wait for their week to think. I knew my parents well enough to understand that silence wasn't a prelude to honesty. It was a strategy, a stall tactic while they tried to figure out what I knew and how much they could still hide. If I wanted answers, I had to bypass them entirely. That meant going straight to the source, Portland. Jonathan Price's name had been a ghost in my life for as long as I could remember, but now I had fragments to start with. An address from one of the old letters, the name of his LLC from the tax return, and a hospital where I'd been born. Marla, my attorney, encouraged me to go. "The more we can corroborate about his intent to be in your life, the stronger your case," she said. So I booked a cheap motel room in Portland for 3 nights, packed a notebook, a recorder, and the letters, and drove the 5 hours south. The address on the letters led me to a modest 2-story craftsman in a quiet neighborhood. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown, but the bones of the house were beautiful. A faded "for sale" sign leaned against the porch. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, wondering how many times he'd stood in that doorway waiting for a reply to letters I never saw. A neighbor in her late 50s was watering her roses across the street. She glanced at me curiously, and I walked over. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. Did you know the man who lived here, Jonathan Price?" Her eyes softened. "Oh, John, yes. He was a good neighbor, kept to himself but always waved. Loved that old boat of his. Why do you ask?" I hesitated. "He was my father." She blinked in surprise, then smiled faintly. "I thought he didn't have kids. He never mentioned—" She trailed off, studying my face. "You've got his eyes." The words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't grow up with him, I explained. I just found out more recently. I'm trying to learn about him. She set down her watering can. Come with me, I'll get you something. Inside her tidy home, she brought out a shoebox of old neighborhood newsletters and photos. In one, Jonathan stood on his porch holding a mug, the same crooked smile I'd seen in the attic photo. In another, he was at a block party, grilling burgers. He was quiet about his personal life, she said, but I remember once, after a few drinks, he mentioned a daughter he wasn't allowed to see, said it wasn't his choice. He mailed her letters every month, never heard back. My chest tightened. He never got a single reply, I murmured. She shook her head. It broke his heart. I thanked her, and before I left, she gave me a small envelope she said she'd found in her mailbox by mistake years ago. It was addressed to me, postmarked 2001. She'd meant to return it but forgot. I opened it right there. Claire, I'm learning how to fix the sails on the boat. Someday, maybe you'll be here with me and we can take it out on the Columbia River. I'll make you the peanut butter cookies you liked. He remembered cookies I didn't even remember liking. The next stop was the marina listed on some of his stationery. An older man named Russ was working on a fishing net. When I introduced myself, his weathered face broke into a slow smile. John's girl, he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. You knew about me? I asked, startled. Of course, he said. He talked about you all the time. Showed me pictures, school photos, ones he said he got before the letters stopped coming back. Said your mom remarried and didn't want him around, but he hoped when you were older, you'd look for him. My throat ached. He kept the boat? Russ nodded toward the far dock. Still there. Needs work. I think he kept it just in case you showed up. The boat was a weathered sailboat with peeling white paint. Wind's Whisper painted in faded blue on the stern. Stepping onto the dock, I ran my fingers over the name. The deck was dusty, but in the small cabin, I found a neatly folded blanket, a tin of cocoa, and, in a drawer, a photograph of me as a toddler, taped to the wall above the tiny bed. I stayed there longer than I meant to, letting the quiet creak of the boat fill the space where my father's voice should have been. That night in the motel, I laid out everything I'd gathered. The neighbor's testimony, Russ's words, the photos, the misplaced letter. Together, they painted a picture my parents had worked hard to keep hidden. Jonathan had loved me. He had tried. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse to search probate records. The clerk found Jonathan's estate file, and my hands clenched as I saw my parents' names listed as claimants in lieu of heir. The paperwork said I had waived interest in the estate, a blatant lie, backed by a decades-old guardianship document they'd dusted off as if I were still a child. I left the courthouse with certified copies for Marla. Outside, I sat on a bench and watched the city move around me, feeling both furious and strangely grounded. For the first time, I had more than my suspicions. I had witnesses. I had records. The last stop was a diner my father had apparently frequented. The waitress, Tina, remembered him well. Always ordered the chicken fried steak, she said. Talked about boats and his daughter. He'd sit there writing letters between sips of coffee. She didn't know if he'd been sick before he passed, only that he'd seemed tired the last year. When I asked if he ever mentioned where else he kept papers or belongings, she nodded toward a storage facility down the street. The manager there confirmed Jonathan had rented a unit for over a decade. It had been cleared after his death, by my parents. That was the final confirmation I needed. They hadn't just taken the money. They'd taken his belongings too, everything he might have left for me that wasn't nailed down. Driving back to Spokane, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The grief was still there, raw and deep, but it had shifted into something sharper. A weapon. My parents had rewritten my childhood, but I was writing the rest. And this time, the truth was going to be in permanent ink. By the time I got back to Spokane, the box of evidence in my trunk felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Not in pounds, but in weight. Every photograph, every letter, every scrap of paper had the power to blow a hole in the version of my life my parents had spent decades building. I drove straight to Marla's office. The walls were lined with shelves full of thick case files, but the space itself was warm, a deliberate trick, I guessed, to make clients feel safe when they were anything but. She looked up from her desk as I walked in, and the moment she saw my face, she pushed aside her work. "Tell me you found something," she said. I set the box down between us. I found everything. We spent the next 2 hours going through it all. The original birth certificate, the amended one, the unopened letters, the neighbor's statement, Russ's testimony about the boat, the misplaced envelope from 2001, the probate records from Portland. With each new item, her expression hardened. "This isn't just inheritance theft," she said finally, leaning back in her chair. "This is a decades-long pattern of fraudulent conduct. They misled a court during the name change. They intercepted correspondence. They claimed guardianship authority over you as an adult to access the estate. That's not just civil liability, it edges into criminal territory." The word criminal settled in my chest like a stone. I'd come into this thinking it was about getting back what was mine. Now I was looking at the possibility of my parents facing charges. "What happens if we prove that?" I asked. "It depends. Prosecutors might see it as a civil matter if they think you're already pursuing restitution. But if there's evidence of forged signatures, falsified statements, or misuse of estate funds, they could take it further." The idea of my parents in court, answering for every lie, was both exhilarating and terrifying. We dug deeper. Marla requested bank records from the estate's transfer and cross-referenced them with my parents' accounts. What we found was staggering. Within 2 weeks of the probate filing, $420,000 had been moved into a joint investment account in David and my mother's names. From there, withdrawals had been made in chunks: $60,000 to pay off their mortgage, $25,000 to remodel the kitchen, $15,000 in cash withdrawals spaced out over a year. "It's almost all spent," Marla said grimly, scrolling through the transactions. "There's about $48,000 left, plus whatever property they acquired with the funds. We can go after both the liquid assets and the tangible ones, but it's going to be a fight." Hearing that most of the money was gone should have crushed me. Instead, it clarified my focus. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about the truth being dragged into the light, whether or not there was still money to recover. While Marla handled the legal groundwork, I started my own parallel investigation. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I couldn't sit still. I went through every letter Jonathan had sent, making a timeline of the postmarks. The pattern was clear: monthly letters from 1998 until early 2003, when they abruptly stopped. That same year, the tax record showed the $15,000 payment to David. It didn't take a detective to connect those dots. I called Tina at the diner again and asked if she remembered anything unusual in those final months. She said Jonathan had seemed defeated, as if something had closed the door for good. He still wrote letters, but he stopped mailing them. Stopped mailing them. The idea haunted me. Where had those final letters gone? Had my parents destroyed them? Or were they sitting in some box I hadn't found yet? I decided to take another trip to their house, not to confront them this time, but to search. I waited until I knew they'd be out, then used my key. I started in the garage, checking old filing cabinets and storage bins. That's when I found it: a locked metal cash box at the bottom of a plastic tub labeled "Holiday Lights." The lock was cheap, One twist of a flathead screwdriver and it popped open. Inside were 3 more unopened letters from Jonathan, all dated late 2003. The handwriting was more hurried than the earlier ones, but the tone was the same, warm, hopeful. In the last one, he wrote, "I don't know if you're getting these anymore, Claire. If you are, know that I love you. If you aren't, I hope someday you find the truth." I closed the box slowly. My father had known, even then, that the truth might only reach me years later. That night, I scanned every letter, every document, and backed them up in multiple places. I wasn't going to risk losing anything now. Marla moved quickly. She filed a petition in probate court to reopen the estate, citing fraud and misrepresentation. She also filed a civil suit against my parents for conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional interference with inheritance. The legal language was cold and precise, but underneath it, I could see the bones of my story: the theft of a name, the theft of a relationship, the theft of a legacy. Within days, my parents were served. David called first. I didn't answer. Then came a text from my mother. "Claire, this is a terrible mistake. We can work this out as a family. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "We stopped being just a family when you took his name away from me." In the weeks that followed, word got around. Extended relatives called, some out of curiosity, some out of outrage. Not at what my parents had done, but at the fact that I was dragging family business into court. The isolation was sharp, but I also received unexpected support. A second cousin who'd known Jonathan, a former neighbor who remembered seeing him leave gifts on our porch that were never given to me. Every new piece of information tightened the net. My parents had spent years convincing me my father was absent by design. In reality, they'd stood at the doorway and blocked him, letter by letter, visit by visit. By the end of that month, Marla had enough evidence to request not only restitution, but punitive damages. "They didn't just take from you," she said, her voice measured. "They deprived you of a fundamental right, to know your parent. Courts take that seriously." The first hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I knew the real battle was about to begin, but for the first time, I felt like I was walking toward the truth instead of being kept in the dark. They'd taken my name, they'd taken my inheritance, but they hadn't taken my resolve. And now I was bringing the fight to their doorstep, in a courtroom, under oath, where lies had a way of unraveling faster than people expected. The first hearing wasn't until a Tuesday morning, but the war started long before that. In the weeks leading up to it, my parents didn't stay quiet. They took their version of events and scattered it like seeds, making sure it reached every corner of our extended family, every family friend, and probably half the neighborhood. I'd hear about it secondhand. A cousin calling to ask why I was suing the people who raised me. An old babysitter messaging on Facebook to say she couldn't believe I was turning on my own mother. David, it seemed, had appointed himself head of the smear campaign. He told people I was after money I didn't earn, that I'd been brainwashed by some greedy lawyer. My mother played the softer role, sighing, telling people she was heartbroken and didn't know what had gotten into me. It was calculated, good cop, bad cop. But they underestimated how much I'd learned to document things. Every conversation I had, I followed up with an email summary. Every rumor I heard, I traced to its source. It wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about building a record of their behavior, because sometimes what people said outside the courtroom mattered just as much as what they said inside. The Monday before the hearing, Marla and I sat in her office going over our plan. She had the precision of a surgeon, every exhibit numbered, every witness prepped. My file had grown to several inches thick. "They're going to try to paint you as ungrateful," she warned. "They'll focus on what they did for you, growing up, not what they took from you. Stay focused on the facts, the name change, the intercepted letters, the fraudulent claim on the estate. I nodded. They're going to lie. They might, she said calmly, and we'll catch them in it. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying old memories, birthdays, holidays, moments when I'd believed we were a normal family. It was surreal to realize that many of those memories would be dissected in a courtroom the next day, not for nostalgia, but as evidence. The courthouse was colder than I expected. I sat at our table with Marla, the smell of old wood and paper thick in the air. Across from us, my parents sat side by side, both in dark suits. David's jaw was tight. My mother's eyes were red, though whether from crying or calculation, I couldn't tell. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. This wasn't the trial, just the first step, a hearing to determine whether the estate could be reopened based on our allegations of fraud. But the tension in the air felt like the opening move in a chess match where every piece mattered. Marla opened with the birth certificates, original and amended, and the court order from Spokane County. She laid out the timeline of the name change, the false claim that my father's whereabouts were unknown, the unopened letters spanning 5 years. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The facts spoke loudly enough. David's attorney countered, trying to frame the name change as standard practice for a blended family, painting Jonathan as an absent father who had no consistent involvement. He claimed my parents had acted in the child's best interest and that the estate transfer was a misunderstanding based on outdated paperwork. Then Marla introduced the probate records. My parents listed as claimants in lieu of heir, the guardianship authority filed as if I were still a minor, the $420,000 transferred into their joint account. It was the first time I saw my parents look rattled. The judge asked a few pointed questions, especially about the guardianship document. David's attorney tried to dodge, claiming it had been presented in error by the probate court. But the judge pressed, "And you didn't think to correct it?" David's silence was answer enough. We left that hearing with no final decision. The judge said she'd review the evidence before ruling, but the tide felt like it was shifting. That afternoon, I drove home feeling both exhausted and strangely energized. For the first time, they'd had to sit in a room and listen to the truth being spoken out loud, with no way to shut it down. But the pushback came quickly. That evening, I got a text from my mother. "You humiliated us today. You've crossed a line you can't uncross." I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting the message without replying. The days that followed were a strange mix of normal life and quiet battles. I still went to work, still bought groceries, still folded laundry. But underneath it all was the hum of something bigger, the knowledge that I was dismantling a lie that had been the foundation of my life. Marla called to update me. The judge had set a follow-up hearing to decide on temporary restrictions on my parents' assets, preventing them from moving or spending what was left of the estate until the case was resolved. That was a win. It meant they couldn't drain the remaining accounts while we fought. Word of that decision got back to them quickly. 2 days later, a mutual acquaintance told me David had been ranting at the local coffee shop, calling me vindictive and saying I was trying to ruin them financially. In reality, they'd done that to themselves. One evening, as I was sorting through yet another stack of scanned documents, I found myself pausing over one of the last letters Jonathan had sent. "If you aren't getting these anymore, I hope someday you find the truth." It felt like he'd known exactly where I'd end up, in the middle of a fight I never asked for, with nothing to hold on to except the truth and the will to see it through. The main hearing was set for the first Monday in June. By then, the whispers had grown louder. People I barely knew seemed to know I was taking my parents to court, and some looked at me with pity, others with quiet admiration. I tried to block it all out. The only opinions that mattered now belonged to the judge and the truth we were about to lay bare. The courthouse lobby that morning was buzzing with voices and the sharp click of shoes on tile. Marla and I arrived early, giving us time to organize our exhibits at the long wooden table inside the courtroom. My parents were already there when we walked in, sitting with their attorney. My mother kept her eyes down. David, on the other hand, looked straight at me, not with shame, but with the cold glare of someone determined to win. When the judge entered, the room stilled. She outlined the purpose of the hearing: to determine whether the estate of Jonathan Price should be reopened and whether my parents had committed fraud in their claim. Then she nodded to Marla. "Counsel, you may proceed." Marla began with the timeline. She moved through it methodically. My birth as Claire Price, the name change at age 5, the sworn statements claiming my father's whereabouts were unknown, the unopened letters spanning years, and finally the estate transfer that had funneled $420,000 into my parents' joint account. She introduced each piece of evidence one at a time: the original birth certificate, the amended one, the probate records, the bank statements. Each was marked as an exhibit and placed before the judge. Then came the witnesses. First was Mrs. Evans, my father's former neighbor. She described the man she'd known for over a decade: quiet, kind, always talking about his daughter. She spoke of the block parties, the boat, the letters he mailed every month. Russ from the marina was next. He testified about my father's love for the boat and the way he kept it ready, just in case his girl showed up one day. He even produced a small Polaroid he'd taken years ago of my father standing at the dock, smiling toward the camera with the boat behind him. Then came Tina from the diner. She told the court how my father would sit in the corner booth, writing letters between bites of chicken fried steak, and how he'd spoken of me often. Each witness chipped away at the picture my parents had painted: that Jonathan Price was absent and uninterested. David's attorney cross-examined them, trying to suggest that fond memories didn't prove consistent involvement, but the testimonies were steady and consistent. Then it was my turn. Taking the stand, I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Marla guided me through my testimony, finding the manila envelope from the attorney, discovering the original birth certificate in the attic, the unopened letters, the tax record showing payment from my father to David, the trip to Portland, the additional letters I found in the locked cash box. I kept my voice steady, but inside I could feel the years of buried hurt pressing against my ribs. I described the pattern of avoidance whenever I asked about my father, the way questions were met with coldness or silence. I told the judge how I had grown up believing he had abandoned me, only to learn he had been writing for years. When Marla asked how I felt when I realized they had claimed the estate without telling me, the truth came out in a single, unshaken sentence. It was the moment I understood my entire childhood had been built on a lie. Then it was my parents' turn. David went first, his voice clipped, his answers rehearsed. He claimed the name change was to protect me from instability, and that Jonathan had drifted in and out. When asked about the unopened letters, he said they had been kept for me to read when I was older, but forgotten. My mother's testimony was softer, but no less calculated. She said she did what she thought was best, insisting that Jonathan wasn't capable of being a father. When asked why they filed as my guardians for the estate when I was in my 30s, she called it a misunderstanding and blamed confusing paperwork. Marla's cross-examination cut through their rehearsed lines. She showed them the guardianship form they'd submitted, the one they'd signed in 2023, listing my birth year accurately, making it impossible to believe they thought I was still a minor. She pressed them on the $420,000 transfer, the immediate mortgage payoff, the kitchen remodel. David's temper flared. "We gave her a better life than he ever could," he snapped. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Miller, answer the question." By the time testimony ended, the room felt heavier, the air thick with everything that had been said, and everything that couldn't be unsaid. But the day wasn't over. As we were packing up, a reporter from the local paper approached Marla in the hallway. "Is this a case of inheritance fraud?" she asked, notebook ready. Marla didn't answer directly. She never did with press, but the fact that a reporter was even there meant word would spread beyond family circles now. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reading over the notes I'd taken during the hearing. It struck me that the truth had finally been spoken in front of witnesses, on the record. No matter how this ended, the version of my life my parents had sold to the world was cracking in public view. The judge announced she'd issue her decision in 2 weeks. Until then, all we could do was wait. But waiting didn't mean standing still. Marla was already preparing for the possibility of a trial if the estate was reopened. And I was bracing myself for the fallout, because if my parents' campaign against me had been bad before, it was about to get worse now that the truth had been aired in open court. What they didn't know, what they still underestimated, was that I'd rather lose everything fighting for the truth than live another day in the lie they built for me. The call from Marla came on a Wednesday afternoon, a little after 3 o'clock. I had been pretending to work, staring at an open spreadsheet that refused to hold my attention. When my phone lit up with her name, my pulse doubled instantly. "Claire," she said, her voice steady, "we have a ruling." I shut my laptop and pressed the phone harder to my ear. "And?" "The judge has decided to reopen Jonathan Price's estate based on clear and convincing evidence of fraud. Your parents' claim as guardians has been invalidated. You are now the sole legal heir." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The words sank in slowly, like pebbles into deep water. Sole legal heir. "There's more," Marla continued. "The court has ordered a full accounting of all funds and property transferred from the estate. The remaining $48,000 in their accounts will be frozen immediately. We can also pursue recovery of the assets purchased with estate funds, the kitchen remodel, the mortgage payoff. That will take more litigation, but the door is open." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Relief wasn't the right word. This wasn't victory so much as the removal of a stone that had been lodged in my chest for months. "What about criminal charges?" I asked. "That's still up to the prosecutor," she said. "The judge referred the matter for review, but we won't know for a while if they'll act. In the meantime, this is a huge step forward." When I hung up, I sat in silence. Part of me wanted to call someone, a friend, maybe even one of the cousins who had supported me. But another part of me just wanted to be alone with the news. I'd fought for this moment. But now that it was here, the weight of what it meant pressed down on me. Because the truth was, no legal ruling could undo what had been taken before I was even old enough to understand. That night, I went to the small box where I kept Jonathan's letters. I chose one from 1999, the year I'd turned 8. "Dear Claire, I hope you like your new school. I'm learning how to cook a little better. Next time I see you, maybe I can make you pancakes." I tried to imagine that day, him in a kitchen, maybe humming to himself, thinking about a little girl who never knew he was making those plans. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry for what I'd lost. Not just the money, not even just the name, but the entire relationship that had been stolen from me. There would be no next time. No pancakes, no boat rides on the Columbia River. Only words on yellowed paper and second-hand memories from people who had known him. 2 days later, I drove to Portland alone. The marina was quiet when I arrived, a light breeze carrying the scent of salt and fuel. Russ was there, working on a length of rope. He looked up and smiled faintly when he saw me. "Heard the news," he said. "I'm glad." We walked down the dock together to Wind's Whisper, my father's sailboat. I stepped aboard slowly, letting my hands trail along the weathered wood. Inside the small cabin, the photograph of me was still taped above the bed. "I'm going to keep her," I said to Russ. He nodded. That's what he would have wanted. Standing there, I realized that this boat was the closest thing I had to time spent with my father. It was a space he had touched, lived in, dreamed in. I decided then that I would restore it, not to sell, but to sail, even if I had to learn from scratch. On my way back from the marina, I stopped at the cemetery where Jonathan was buried. His headstone was simple. Jonathan Price, 1967 to 2023. Beloved friend, no mention of being a father. I knelt beside it, tracing the letters with my fingertips. "I found the truth," I whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of the river. In the weeks that followed, Marla began the process of recovering what was left of the estate. She filed liens against my parents' property equivalent to the value of the kitchen remodel and part of the mortgage payoff. It was unlikely I'd ever see the full amount, but that mattered less now. The money was symbolic, the record was everything. Word of the ruling spread quickly. Some relatives who had stayed silent before suddenly reached out, offering lukewarm congratulations as if they'd been on my side all along. Others doubled down, insisting my father wasn't worth all this trouble. My parents didn't contact me directly, but I heard through a mutual acquaintance that David was furious about the liens, and my mother had been telling anyone who would listen that I was destroying the family. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I focused on rebuilding, not just financially, but personally. I started therapy, something I'd been putting off for years. My therapist helped me unpack the layers of betrayal, the way having my identity rewritten as a child had shaped how I saw myself. "It wasn't just a name change," she said one afternoon. "It was the removal of a part of your history. They didn't just erase him, they erased part of you." That truth settled deep in my chest. For years, I'd blamed myself for not asking more questions, for accepting their version of events. But I was a child, and children believe what they're told, especially when it comes from the people they trust most. Therapy also helped me navigate the strange mix of grief and victory. I had won the legal battle, but I'd lost something I could never get back: time. No court could return the years I might have had with my father if my parents had made a different choice. One evening, I sat at my desk and began drafting a letter, not to my parents, but to Jonathan. I wrote about the boat, about meeting his neighbors, about how his letters had carried me through the hardest months of this fight. I told him I would sail Wind's Whisper one day, and that when I did, I'd imagine him there beside me, teaching me how to read the wind. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the box with the others. By late summer, the boat was in dry dock for repairs. I spent weekends sanding the hull, replacing worn lines, and learning the basics from Russ. It was slow, meditative work, the kind that gave my mind room to breathe. Every so often, I'd catch myself smiling, thinking of how different this year might have been if I'd never opened that manila envelope. I would still be Claire Miller, believing a version of my life that wasn't mine. My father would still be a ghost I'd been told to forget. Instead, I had my name back. I had the truth, and piece by piece, I was reclaiming the parts of myself that had been hidden for decades. When Marla called in September to tell me the asset recovery process was nearly complete, I felt a strange mix of closure and anticlimax. The remaining funds would be transferred to me soon. The liens would take longer to pay out, but that was fine. I'd already received the most valuable thing I could have hoped for: the knowledge of who I really was. The night the transfer came through, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the last light fade from the sky. I thought about what to do with the money. It didn't feel right to spend it carelessly. Part of me wanted to use it for something tied to my father, maybe to keep the boat in the family, maybe to donate in his name. But another part of me knew I needed to invest in myself, too. After all, reclaiming my identity wasn't just about the past. It was about the future I was finally free to build on my own terms. The official court paperwork arrived in early October. The envelope was thick, sealed with a gold foil sticker from the county clerk's office. I sat at my kitchen table, my fingers hovering over the flap for a long moment before I tore it open. Inside was a certified document from the Superior Court of Oregon, petition granted, restoration of legal name to Claire Elizabeth Price. There it was, in bold black type, my father's name, my name. Not the one I'd been forced to carry since childhood, not the one that felt like a daily reminder of someone else's claim over me. No, Price. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, feeling the raised edges as if touching it might anchor this reality in my bones. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the undoing of a theft that had lived in my skin for decades. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt light. Changing my name back wasn't simple. It meant new ID cards, updating work records, changing utility bills, notifying the DMV. It was exhausting and bureaucratic. But every time I signed Claire Price on a form, it was like planting a flag on a piece of land that had always been mine. At work, my colleagues congratulated me. My boss updated my email signature without hesitation. In my personal life, reactions were mixed. Friends celebrated. Extended family stayed silent. My parents never acknowledged it, and that was fine, because I no longer needed their validation. By late October, I'd made a decision about the remaining estate funds. I kept a portion in a savings account, earmarked for the restoration and upkeep of Wind's Whisper. The rest I invested carefully. In my retirement, in an emergency fund, and in a scholarship fund in Jonathan Price's name for young adults pursuing marine biology at the University of Oregon. Marla helped me set it up, and when I explained my reasoning, her eyes softened. "It's a beautiful tribute," she said. "You've taken something they tried to steal and turned it into something lasting." I didn't invite my parents to the small dedication ceremony for the scholarship fund. Instead, I invited Russ, a few of Jonathan's old friends from the marina, and my own circle of supporters. We gathered by the docks on a crisp Saturday morning. I stood on Wind's Whisper, its hull freshly painted, and spoke into the autumn air. "My father didn't get to teach me how to sail," I began. "He didn't get to see me grow up or share in my life the way he should have, but today, I can choose to carry his name forward, not just in my own identity, but in something that will outlive me." Russ nodded from the dock, his weathered hands folded in front of him. When the ceremony ended, I took Wind's Whisper out for its first short trip under my ownership, Russ at my side. The wind was calm, the sun bright, the water smooth, and for the first time, I felt like I was steering more than just the boat. I was steering my life. Not long after, my mother called. It was the first direct communication since the court ruling. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Her voice was tight. "Claire, your father and I heard you changed your name. Is this permanent?" "Yes," I said simply. A pause. Then, "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" They think the truth," I interrupted. "Because that's what it is. You've humiliated us." "I told the truth," I said again. "If that humiliates you, maybe you should ask yourself why." There was silence. Then she muttered something about not doing this over the phone and hung up. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down. I didn't feel the sting I might have felt months ago, just clarity. We were not going to agree, and I was done bending myself into shapes to make them comfortable. November rolled in with cold rain and early sunsets. The marina was quiet, but I went often. Sailing lessons became my escape, a way to connect with my father in absence, to prove to myself that I could carry his legacy forward. Russ was patient, letting me make mistakes, correcting my knots, teaching me to read the wind. One afternoon, while we were tying Wind's Whisper back to the dock, Russ said, "You know, Jonathan used to talk about wanting to sail to the San Juan Islands." I smiled. "Maybe next summer." "Maybe," he said, grinning. Thanksgiving came. I didn't go to my parents' house. Instead, I hosted a small dinner at mine with Linda from work, her husband, and a few friends. We cooked together, laughed until our stomachs hurt, and when dessert came, someone proposed a toast. "To Claire Price," Linda said, raising her glass, "for taking her life back." I felt my face flush, but I lifted my glass too. "To truth," I said, "even when it's uncomfortable." The clink of glasses felt like a seal on this new chapter. By December, the liens against my parents' property had begun to bite. I heard through mutual contacts that they'd refinanced to cover the initial payments. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt detached. The legal process had done what it was meant to do. My role was complete. On Christmas Eve, I drove to the cemetery alone. The air was crisp, the grass frosted white. I knelt by Jonathan's grave and placed a small wreath, the ribbon reading simply, "From your daughter." I told him about the boat, about the scholarship, about my name. I didn't know if anyone could hear from beyond, but I hoped, if they could, that he'd know his daughter had fought to reclaim him. New Year's Eve arrived, and I spent it quietly at home. No big parties, no countdown crowds. Just me, a fire in the fireplace, and a journal. I wrote about the year, the discovery, the betrayal, the court fight, the win. I wrote about the grief that sat beside the victory, the complicated truth that reclaiming something stolen doesn't erase the time it was gone. But I also wrote about strength, about how I'd learned that you can survive having your foundation ripped away if you're willing to rebuild, brick by brick, even if you have to do it alone. In the last entry of the night, I wrote, "My name is Claire Elizabeth Price. I am the daughter of Jonathan Price. I am not a mistake, not a secret, and not an afterthought. My story is mine to tell, and I will tell it." When I closed the journal, the clock was ticking toward midnight. Outside, faint bursts of fireworks began. I didn't make resolutions. I didn't need to. I had already made the only one that mattered, to live as myself, without apology. And for the first time, I truly believed I could. If you've ever had your story rewritten by someone else, whether it was your name, your history, or your truth, know this. You have the right to take it back. You have the right to stand in the full light of who you are, no matter who tries to dim it. And when you do, you'll find that the power was always yours.